At its core, the shoot 'em up asks a very simple question. How long can you survive under pressure? Not pressure from a story, not pressure from realism, just pressure. Pure, mechanical, relentless. Now that question didn't appear fully formed. It emerged slowly, through trial, error, and technology that wasn't ready for it. The genre that we recognize today is the result of decades of designers discovering, often by accident, that limitation could be more powerful than freedom. To follow it properly, we have to go back to a time when no one knew what a shoot 'em up was. So let's go back, way back, to a time before arcades existed, before joysticks and quarter slots, to a cramped room at MIT where a handful of graduate students were about to invent an entire medium accidentally. In 1962, a programmer named Steve Russell sat in front of a DEC PDP-1 minicomputer, a machine that cost roughly $120,000, which translates to over $1 million today, and he created something that had no business existing yet. Spacewar isn't commercial. It wasn't meant to make money. It was, in the purest sense, a toy that Russell and his colleagues built because they wanted to see spaceships shoot at each other on a screen. The game featured two vessels, nicknamed the Needle and the Wedge, locked in combat around a central star whose gravity, well, could slingshot you toward victory or drag you to your doom. Peter Sampson created Expensive Planetarium, a background of accurate star positions that Russell incorporated into the game. Dan Edwards added the gravity well mechanic. The game became a collaborative experiment in what interactive entertainment could be. Players had limited fuel and torpedoes, and there was a panic button, a hyperspace feature that would teleport your ship to a random location, though with each use came an increasing chance that the jump would suddenly destroy you instead. Now, what Russell and his MIT colleagues didn't realize was that they had just established the fundamental grammar of video game combat. The idea of dodging while shooting, of managing limited resources under pressure, of using the environment itself as both weapon and threat, all of it started here, in what was essentially a glorified science project. Spacewar spread through the small network of universities that had PDP-1 computers, mutating and evolving as different programmers added their own twists. But almost nobody got to play it. With only 53 PDP-1 units ever sold, most without monitors, the audience remained vanishingly small. It would take 16 years before someone figured out how to bottle that lightning and sell it to the masses. That someone was Tomohiro Nishikado, and his creation arrived in Japanese arcades in April of 1978 like a cultural earthquake. Space Invaders didn't just establish the shoot 'em up as a commercial genre, it fundamentally rewired how people thought about video games. Nishikado had spent a year designing both the game and the custom hardware required to run it, working largely alone with handmade development tools. He wanted to improve upon Breakout, that Atari classic where you bounce a ball to destroy bricks, but he craved something with more tension, more consequence. Early designs featured tanks, then soldiers, but Nishikado felt that shooting human figures would be too violent. After watching the anime space battleship Yamato and seeing magazine coverage of Star Wars, he pivoted to alien creatures. Designs inspired by octopi, squids, and crabs from H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. Now, the genius of Space Invaders lay in what Nishikado couldn't do. His hardware wasn't powerful enough to animate the aliens smoothly, so he set the game in space with a black background to hide the limitations. And when he discovered that the processor rendered frames faster as aliens were destroyed, causing the remaining invaders to speed up, he recognized it not as a bug, but as a feature. That accelerating tempo, that rising pulse of dread as the last few invaders screamed across the screen, became the game's beating heart. Space Invaders introduced concepts that we now take for granted. Multiple lives, high-score competition, and enemies that actually fired back at you. Previous shooting games had targets that sat there passively while you picked them off. Nishikado's aliens attacked. They descended. They created pressure. And that pressure made the release of destroying them feel earned. The commercial response was unprecedented. In Japan, the game reportedly caused a shortage of 100 yen coins. Though this legend has been disputed, the fact that people believed it speaks to the cultural impact. Small grocery stores converted into Space Invaders houses overnight. By 1982, the game had grossed $3.8 billion worldwide, with a net profit of $450 million. Now, to put that into perspective, Star Wars, the highest grossing film of that era, had earned $486 million total, with profits around $175 million. A video game had outperformed Hollywood's biggest blockbuster. But Space Invaders, for all its brilliance, was also a prison. Your ship moved along a single horizontal axis. The aliens marched in rigid formations. The screen never scrolled. If the genre was going to grow, something had to break open those walls. The first cracks appeared in 1979, when Namco released Galaxian into Japanese arcades. On the surface, it looked like another Space Invaders clone, and plenty of those existed, over 100 by some counts. But designer Katsunori Sawano brought a different sensibility to the formula. He wanted enemies that felt alive. In Galaxian, the aliens don't just descend in lockstep. Individual ships broke formation and dove at you, swooping and spiraling with their own attack patterns. The flagship attacked with escorts, and destroying the full formation earned bonus points. Seems trivial now, but it was a breakthrough. Enemies weren't just targets anymore. They behaved with intent. The screen hadn't changed much, but the relationship between player and enemy had. Galaxian became the second highest grossing arcade game of both 1979 and 1980 in Japan, trailing only Space Invaders and then Pac-Man. In America, where Midway distributed it, the game sold 50,000 units by 1982. And more importantly, its hardware innovations laid the groundwork for future systems. The sprite techniques pioneered in Galaxian were closely studied by Nintendo during the development of Radar Scope and Donkey Kong, influencing how the company would think about on-screen characters as it moved towards its own hardware. Now, while Galaxian was teaching aliens to dive bomb, another game was about to tear down the walls entirely. During 1980, Williams Electronics, a pinball company, was trying to figure out video games. They gave the project to Eugene Jarvis, a pinball programmer with no video game experience whatsoever. What Jarvis delivered would change everything. Defender didn't just scroll, it scrolled in both directions, letting players fly left or right across a wraparound world far larger than the screen could display. At the top of the screen sat a radar minimap showing the entire playfield, a feature that had appeared in games before, but never integrated so essentially into moment-to-moment gameplay. You weren't just shooting aliens anymore. You were defending astronauts from abduction, racing across the landscape to intercept landers before they could carry humans to the top of the screen and transform into fast-moving mutants. The control scheme was notorious. A two-way joystick plus 5 buttons for thrust, reverse, fire, smart bomb, and hyperspace. Early players struggled. At the 1980 AMOA trade show, crowds walked past the Defender cabinet, intimidated by its complexity. Jarvis himself could barely break 60,000 points. But those who persevered discovered something extraordinary, a game of genuine depth, where skilled play felt like piloting an actual spacecraft rather than nudging a cursor. Defender eventually sold over 55,000 units and grossed more than $1 billion in quarters. It became Williams' best-selling arcade game ever, and established Jarvis as one of the medium's first celebrity designers. More significantly, it created the horizontal scrolling shooter as a distinct subgenre, a form that would dominate the next decade of arcade development. Now, just 2 months after Defender hit American arcades, Konami released Scramble in Japan. Where Defender emphasized freedom and reflexes, Scramble demanded memorization and precision. The screen scrolled in one direction only, at a fixed speed that the player couldn't control. You piloted through mountainous terrain, tight caverns, and enemy installations, dropping bombs on ground targets while shooting airborne threats. A fuel gauge constantly depleted, forcing you to destroy fuel tanks scattered throughout the levels, or die from an empty tank. Scramble was the first side-scrolling shooter to feature multiple distinct levels, 6 in total, each with its own visual theme and challenge profile. The cavern sections, with their narrow passages and swarms of enemies, established a template that countless shooters would follow. The game also introduced foreground collision detection for terrain, meaning pilot air could kill you just as surely as enemy fire. Konami's game spread quickly, and before long, similar shooters were simply called Scramble clones, much like the wave of Invader games that followed Space Invaders. Its influence was hard to miss. Between Defender's freedom and Scramble's structure, between American chaos and Japanese precision, the horizontal shooter genre split into two philosophical camps that would compete and cross-pollinate for the next 15 years. But before we follow that thread, we need to look upward, literally, because while the West was pioneering horizontal movement, Japan was perfecting the vertical scroll. In January of 1983, Namco released Xevious, and the shoot-'em-up finally looked like it was happening somewhere real. When Masanobu Endo took over the project that would become Xevious, he abandoned the idea of another abstract shooter and aimed for something new. A coherent world. Forests, rivers, and mechanical structures weren't just background art. They mattered. Enemies and secrets were woven into the landscape itself, rewarding players who paid attention instead of just firing forward. Xevious wasn't just about shooting waves of enemies anymore. It felt like fighting across a place with its own rules and history. Xevious became an unprecedented success in Japan, recording sales figures not seen since Space Invaders 5 years earlier. By mid-1983, Xevious had climbed to number 4 on American arcade charts, while its Famicom release sold out in days and moved over 1 million copies in Japan, proving that shooters could thrive beyond the arcade. More than raw sales, Xevious established what a vertical scrolling shooter could look like and feel like. Its influence touched everything from Twinbee, Raiden, to Rayforce. Before Endo's creation, shooters happened in abstract space. After it, they could happen anywhere. By 1985, the shoot-'em-up had proven that it could move, could scroll, could create worlds worth defending. But it still felt in some fundamental way like a test of reflexes alone, a survival contest where you dodged and fired until you inevitably died. What it lacked was strategy. What it lacked was choice. That changed in a Konami development room, where a team originally set out to make Scramble 2 and ended up creating something far more ambitious. The project lead, Hirogasu Machikuji, asked his team what kind of game they wanted to build. A shoot-'em-up, they answered, one that could surpass Namco's Xevious. They would call it Gradius, and it would introduce a mechanic so elegant that variations of it still appear in shooters today. Gradius introduced a power meter that turned upgrades into a choice instead of an automatic reward. Destroys certain enemies and they drop capsules, each one pushing a cursor along the meter. Cash in early for a small boost, or hold out for stronger weapons. But the longer you wait, the more you risk losing everything if you die. For the first time, upgrading your ship wasn't automatic. It was a choice. The development team spent a year refining the system, testing 20 different movement patterns for the options alone before settling on one that felt right. They drew inspiration from science fiction films, particularly the anime Lensman, whose plasma laser directly influenced Gradius's iconic beam weapon. The mysterious Moai heads scattered throughout certain stages came from a desire to match Xevious's sense of ancient secrets, Easter Island monuments that somehow found their way into space, spitting rings of energy at passing spacecraft. Gradius defined the horizontal shooter for a generation. Its silhouette, the Vic Viper, angular and aggressive, became iconic enough to appear as an Easter egg in dozens of later Konami titles. The game spawned sequels, spin-offs, parodies, the brilliant Parodius series, and countless imitators. But perhaps its greatest legacy was proving that a shooter could have depth beyond pure reaction time, that the genre could accommodate planning and personality alongside precision. A year later, Sega answered with Fantasy Zone, a game that took nearly the opposite approach. Where Gradius was sleek and mechanical, Fantasy Zone was absurd and candy-colored. The protagonist, a sentient spaceship named Opa Opa, bounced through surreal landscapes fighting enemies that looked like escaped carnival prizes. The game borrowed Defender's ability to fly in either direction and combined it with a shop system where players could purchase temporary upgrades between stages. Fantasy Zone, along with Konami's Twinbee from 1985, codified what would become known as the Shoot-'em-up, shooters that wrapped their precision mechanics in deliberately childish aesthetics. Twinbee itself was remarkable for several reasons. It ran on Konami's new Bubble System hardware, featured simultaneous two-player cooperative gameplay at a time when that was still unusual, and introduced a bell-based power-up system where shooting clouds revealed collectible chimes. Twinbee became one of Japan's most successful arcade games in early 1985. But 1987 brought something darker, something that would push the genre toward its logical extreme. Irem's R-Type arrived in arcades with a reputation for two things: staggering visual design and absolutely punishing difficulty. The game moved slowly compared to its contemporaries, deliberately, methodically, forcing players to memorize every enemy placement, every projectile pattern, every claustrophobic corridor. Where Gradius rewarded aggressive play, R-Type demanded patience. You couldn't blast your way through, you had to think your way through. The development team drew inspiration from Gradius, but also from darker sources. H.R. Giger's biomechanical nightmares from the Alien films informed the aesthetic, creating bosses that look like something between spacecraft and internal organs. The first boss, Dopkeratops, remains one of the most recognizable enemies in shooter history, a writhing mass of flesh and metal that players had to destroy piece by piece. The Force Pod became R-Type's signature mechanic. This glowing orange orb could attach to the front or back of your ship, providing additional firepower and limited protection. Designer Abiko cited the behavior of dung beetles as inspiration for how the Force moved and attached, an unlikely source for such an elegant piece of game design. R-Type was famously hard. New players often died almost immediately, but with time the game revealed its logic. Enemy patterns made sense, and careful use of the Force could turn tough moments into manageable ones. That balance helped R-Type become Japan's top arcade game of 1987, and start a series that lasted for decades. By 1990, shooters either needed new ideas or perfect execution. Seibu Kaihatsu, short on money after Dynamite Duke, chose execution. Working with limited hardware, the team studied games like 1942, Xevious, and Twin Cobra, and focused on getting the basics right. Raiden looked familiar, but it played cleanly. The difficulty felt fair, hitboxes were clear, and every weapon had a purpose. It was easy to overlook at first, but word spread. Within a year, the game sold 17,000 units and climbed into Japan's top arcade charts, proving polish still mattered. The game's success saved its developer and launched a franchise that continues to this day. While Raiden proved that classic shooters could still sell, Toaplan was quietly pushing the genre in a new direction. Its games filled the screen with dense bullet patterns that players had to read, not just dodge. Batsugun in 1993 marked the turning point, making bullet hell a deliberate style rather than an accident of difficulty. Cave's Dodanpachi refined the idea in 1997. Tiny hitboxes, carefully arranged bullet curtains, and scoring systems built for mastery. Bullet Hell was designed for everyone. It was designed for the players who stayed. Dodanpachi did well in arcades and was well received on home consoles, but its bigger impact was what it represented. Shooters were becoming more focused, aimed at experienced players rather than beginners. The dense bullet patterns helped the game stand out in arcades and gave longtime fans the kind of challenge that they were looking for. In the early 2000s, shoot-'em-ups were searching for a future. Arcades were fading outside of Japan, home consoles could run perfect ports, and the audience had split. Casual players moved on, while dedicated fans wanted something deeper. One response came in 2001 with Ikaruga. Director Hiroshi Iuchi slowed the genre down, building the game around a simple rule. Bullets had colors, and your ship could switch between them. Matching colors were safe. The wrong color meant instant death. Instead of pure reflex, the game demanded planning. It confused some players at first, but over time earned respect for proving that shooters could evolve through ideas, not just difficulty. In 2003, Geometry Wars took a different approach. Originally hidden inside Project Gotham Racing 2 before becoming a standalone Xbox Live Arcade release, it cut shooters down to their essentials. A ship, a single arena, endless enemies, and a rising score. No levels, no story, just movement, pressure, and survival. It proved that simplicity, when done right, still worked. A decade later, Resogun brought the genre into the HD era. Released in 2013 as a PlayStation 4 launch title, it reworked Defender's rescue-based gameplay with modern technology. Entire levels shattered into millions of particles as players balanced firepower, movement, and saving humans. It proved shoot-'em-ups could still serve as technical showcases without losing their identity. In 2014, Crimson Clover rounded out the picture. Created by a solo developer and inspired by classic bullet hell, it added difficulty options that welcomed new players while still pushing experts. It acknowledged a smaller audience and met it where it was. Together, these games showed how shoot-'em-ups survived after the arcade era, by slowing down, stripping back, scaling up, or opening the door wider, but always staying true to the core. From Spacewar's gravity, well, to Resogun's voxel storms, from Space Invaders' marching aliens to Ikaruga's polarity puzzles, the shoot-'em-up has traveled an extraordinary distance. It began as a simple experiment on a machine that few people could access, built by someone who only wanted to see spaceships fire at each other. Decades later, that same idea lives on phones, consoles, and digital storefronts. The technology changed completely. The appeal didn't. Today, the genre no longer fights for the spotlight. It exists by choice. Games like Nex Machina, Crimson Clover, Blue Revolver, Astabreed, and Enter the Gungeon carry it forward, blending classic discipline with modern ideas like procedural systems and accessibility options. Shoot-'em-ups didn't disappear with the arcades. They found a smaller, more dedicated place to live. As long as there's satisfaction in moving, shooting, and surviving one more wave, the genre will keep finding new ways to exist. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like. It really means a lot to us. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss the next one.